Right, hello, let's get started. Welcome to the 12 o'clock session here at Adelaide Writers Week, which is GRIFT, Lies and Influence. It's in my opinion, it's going to be probably one of the most fun sessions you're going to have at this entire event, because everyone loves a good grifter. I am here today with Fiona McLeod, who is chair of the Accountability Roundtable, former Labor MP candidate, and author of Easy Lies and Influence, which serves as something of a call to arms to defend the values of trust, accountability, and transparency. Yeah, that's right, Cloud. Yeah. Also with us today is Michael West, who's a journalist, muckraker, veteran bomb thrower, who probably needs no introduction because he seems to be, a bit of a rock star. Now, look, I want to kind of begin in a bit of by indulging a personal question here, which is, we've had 9 years of coalition government. We have a federal election we're on the doorstep of a federal election. We have a state election here in South Australia in a couple of weeks. We've had floods, we've had fires, we've had systemic dismantling of any effort to deal with climate change. We've had robo-debt, we've had the scandals in the Murray-Darling Basin, we've had the Me Too moment. We've had all these kind of high scandals. I kind of want to just begin by asking you both, what the hell is going on?
Well, there's no question we're in a crisis and it's got many faces, and probably the largest of those is the climate crisis that we're facing and our government's complete inability to deal with threats, real and perceived. For me, it's a broader threat. It's a threat of our government's failure to acknowledge that they need to put policies and practices in place to deal with threats before they arise, to preempt them, to actually deliver services to people as the core of their function, rather than just getting re-elected.
Michael, you got thoughts?
They just don't seem to want to think about the science and rational government. I mean, we've seen it with climate. We've seen it now with the floods, the tardy response, the inability to be able to govern properly. It's all PR and announcements. We saw it with the aged care thing. They were late. People were dying in aged care homes and in lockdown, having to die alone, Australia's elderly people, because they were late with their booster shots, which they promised. They were late with their surge workforce, which they promised. And they were late with the vax. Oh, sorry, not the vax. There was one other thing they promised that they were late with. It was something to do with something medical. But in any case, there's this schism, this void between what they should be doing and what the expert advice tells them, whether it's pandemic advice or climate advice, and their execution of government. It's a complete failure. And as we were discussing earlier in the green room, I mean, there's a fundamental problem now with a crisis of confidence and a lack of trust in government, and not just government, major institutions as well. So the question is where we go to from here.
You both, just before we dive into the guts of the session, you both you've been working on this stuff for a while. You've been around, you've seen things. How bad is it? Is this the worst you've seen it, or is this getting worse? Give us some perspective.
I've never seen it as bad as I've seen it under this current Morrison government. The degree to which we are emulating Trump and the way that problems are spun away by lies and obfuscation is as bad as I've ever seen it. Over many years, there have been many problems with government, and those of both colours and those in power who can stand up and say, I got it wrong, there have been many of those over the years. This government has not dealt with so many problems, so many internal, unconstitutional, illegal, unlawful acts of its own ministers that I'm just flabbergasted that we're in this situation where the political judgment has been, stick with them or you'll be hurt. And that's the judgment that we're seeing again and again and again, particularly in the grants sphere where rorts are now so obvious. And it's a government that is counting on a collective amnesia and a collective shrug because we don't know what to do with it as citizens. We don't know how to respond to this beyond getting angry in our small communities and angry in our over our coffees with each other. We don't know how to respond to it. And I think it has provided fertile ground for independents to rise, particularly independents who are focusing on issues of integrity as a core of their campaign promise. It has pushed politics to an extraordinary place. And I've never seen it before. And as somebody who works in justice before the courts with cases every day, it is profoundly disturbing to me that we are in this place.
What's the question? I can't top that.
Well, fair enough. All right. Well, okay. So look, I want to begin. So Fiona, you've recently authored the Easy Lies and Influence, which is this little book, and it's available in the book tent. By the way, please go buy it. Help support the people here today. Hoping you can maybe have a read.
Sure. In a country such as Australia, where the rule of law is well established and respected, corruption is not recognised as such when it buys influence and profit for those with means. Yet corruption distorts our markets and business confidence, encourages monopolies, fosters inequality, suppresses productivity, adds to the cost of doing business and thus to the cost of goods and services, and inhibits growth. The cost of corruption here has been estimated by the Australia Institute at around 4% of GDP, or $72.3 billion each year. In Australia, corruption spends public funds in pursuit of power, rewards favour and strips support from meritorious programs. It silences journalists and those charged with upholding standards of integrity by depriving them of funding. Grift and stacking are commonplace as those seeking influence infiltrate the structures of power. Corruption acknowledges loyalty through appointments to office and the preferencing of those within the favoured network ahead of others of equal or greater talent. It conceals itself through unfit-for-purpose access to information laws and processes, vague budget commitments, the assertion of unchecked executive discretion, a quick media cycle, and overburdened parliamentary committees. It undermines trust in government at a time when trust is vital to the delivery of programs to keep us safe. It allows mistrust to fester, which is nourishment for conspiracy and civil unrest. A failure of accountability in this country has resulted in laws and policy outcomes that rob our children of the prospect of a bright future.
I might just add to that because I never forget there was a little incident. I was on a plane in South America, but going between Peru, I think, and Chile, and I was sitting next to a mining engineer, who was Argentinian, and we got talking, and he just started very sadly telling me about the corruption in Argentina and how, and you can see it there's much less corruption in Chile, and their economy has lifted the livelihoods of so many of the people compared to Argentina, where you still have this very rich class, but then everybody else is sort of foundering about. He said the corruption is so endemic there that he doesn't work there because on any project there'll be so many people with their hands out for illicit payments that projects just don't go ahead in this country with incredible natural resources. And you can see that economically in the progress of Chile and other countries versus what's happened in Argentina. He was very sad about it, this guy, but that goes to your point that corruption does have a huge cost. And we are at a point in Australia where it is, the water market, I'm doing another session this afternoon with the guys, Hamilton and Kells, who wrote the book on Australia's water market. The corruption. We know some of it has been publicly seeped into the public domain, the Cayman Islands caper from Angus. But, there is a huge cost, and it will get worse unless they address it properly. And a Federal Integrity Commission would be a good good place to start, but they promised it 3 or 400 days ago, and it's one of those non-core promises that's never come good.
It was never going to come good. It was a promise to buy the continued support of crossbenchers at the time, before the last election. It was never going to be delivered because the model they knew would be attacked the minute it was put up, and it was attacked the minute it was put up, and there was never any intention to create that sort of platform for an open fight about the way that the national ICAC would be structured. So I don't believe there was ever an intention to bring that legislation into Parliament.
That's something I wanted to ask you. I'll ask you both. That when people, I think on some level people see that, they see it play out, and they read that correctly, and they see exactly, they read it the same way you do. How much has watching that level of cynicism play out made people numb to this idea?
Should I go first? It was a really interesting, that's one word for it, experience being a candidate in the last federal election, because I stood for a seat that was a very relatively well-off seat in inner city Melbourne, that was a traditional Liberal stronghold where people were well-educated and understood political issues. But the collective resignation about integrity issues and what had just happened to Malcolm Turnbull at the time was sort of shrugged off as, well, you're all the same and what can we do about it? And I think there is a deep cynicism amongst people that they can do anything. They can demand integrity of politicians because we see this cycle of spin continuing all the time. We watch the daily news where we're given the brush off and the glib explanation for why things have failed. And I think we are deeply anaesthetised to the way our politicians behave in terms of their lack of accountability and don't know how to deal with that. We don't know how to demand accountability from our governments. And in all manner of spheres, the National ICAC an Anti-Corruption Commission is one obvious place, but all manner of things, because we think, well, actually it would be quite nice to have a new changing room for the girls at my soccer oval. Who cares whether they're delivering on the NDIS or aged care or, you know, some of these other major national problems, because my daughter will have somewhere to live. Leave aside that there's actually no constitutional or lawful basis for the minister to direct funds to my electorate. That doesn't matter because that would be nice. So it's two things. I think one is that sort of collective shrug, and the other is you get a crumb from government, or you're promised a crumb, whether it's delivered or not, and you think, okay, well, I'll stick with my sense of tribalism and vote the way I always have.
There's like a tired, weary acceptance of corruption. And there was a seminal point in New South Wales with former Premier Gladys Berejiklian, where she was bailed up by somebody about pork barrelling and, you know, the misuse of our money, our taxes, for political party purposes. And she said, it was disarmingly honest, she said, well, it's legal. So corruption is legal, and so, I mean, there are legal defamation things that come into play here, because if you call somebody corrupt, now can you be sued? Because it used to be a really nasty word to call somebody corrupt, but now, according to Gladys, it's legal. And I think that changed the playing field to, well, you know, there's a lot of the, oh, they do it, so we do it too thing. I mean, this JobKeeper, this massive transfer of wealth, this $89 billion, about half of which was not needed, you know, that went to places like Gucci and Prada, making record profits overseas in their Italian fashion houses. And here we are giving them this money. And when I chased all the doctors' colleges about this, because they're all in on the thing too, as if doctors are suddenly going to stop paying their membership fees to the Royal Council of you know, General Practitioners was one of them. And they just said, and the thing back from some of the doctors, because the doctors were turfed off about it, not the people in the colleges, but they said, when they cornered their people about it, everybody else was doing it, so we do do it too. That was our advice. There was no clause which said you have to pay it back. It was free money. They did it. We're going to do it. So where does it all go from here? This moral relativism, this sort of swamp of sort of official behaviour and public behaviour. I mean, I really don't know where it goes. It does need a breaking point, because how can you undergo proper reforms for government, doing the things the government should be doing to make this a better place to live, if there's no public trust in government? I mean, what have they actually done, this mob, in 8 or 9 years? They haven't done much. They probably had record non-sitting for a start. They probably got through a lot less laws. I haven't looked at the numbers, than even Julia Gillard got during her time. So they haven't done much. But I'll tell you what, they made a lot of announcements.
One of my favourite stories during the pandemic was there was a lovely news report that was run about the lobby group for the forces of big parking. I didn't know they had a lobby group for starts. All the car park operators have an association, and the line was, we absolutely need a bailout because no one's driving their cars anymore, no one's parking, and we're an essential service. Can we please have some money to bail us out? And I just thought, well, that was the perfect illustration of the moment. But to pick up on your thread, kind of this growing pool of cynicism, this kind of sense that there's all this wrong. I mean, how? And I want to ask you, Michael, because you work in this area, you work in the media, you work in journalism, and people. Despite all this, despite this frustration and this kind of disbelief, there is still the sense of hope, or that it seems like there's still the sense that the truth will out. And I'm wondering what you make of that, and whether there's this idea that we're all so numbed beyond repair, or actually no, there's still hope. There's still hope there, even if it's smaller and diminished.
I'm not very good at philosophising about this stuff. All I can say is that people often say to me, because I deal with this stuff all the time, I just see it as my role to go where the mainstream won't go and go, look at that shocking tax avoider, look at that corruption there, look at this. And people say, oh, gee, don't you get sick of, writing these pieces about terrible corruption? They get you down so much, don't they? And I said, well, you have to approach it as a job. If you're a doctor or something, you're not going to get overly involved with each patient. So you just go, right, that's a shocker, that's in the public interest, let's write it up, maybe cop a legal threat or two, but that's just my role doing that. But I've even got people supporting me in the community who say, look, I can't read your stuff, it's too depressing, but somebody's got to do it, so I'll back you. And in fact, the funny thing is, when I got booted out of the media for the crime of journalism, the mainstream media, 6 years ago, I had no idea. I just wanted to continue being a journalist, so I didn't really have a business model or anything, and the community backed me, which was great, and managed to make a living out of it and employ a couple of people. So it's been good, but that wouldn't be happening. I could not get away with that unless there was a failure in the media, unless there was a failure, myriad failures of government and large institutions too. Because we've gone from a situation of laissez-faire and capitalism to a situation of crony capitalism now. I mean, the fundamental problem, I think, here too is we've had pretty good economic conditions given everything, but if you look at the schism between the rich and poor, what the government policies did during the pandemic was to transfer a lot of wealth to the top end of town, because it was all about housing and shares. So all of us know if you've got houses and shares, you're great. You're sitting pretty. You're a lot richer than you were pre-pandemic. But of course, the underclass has grown. And how you can, if migration kicks back in and underemployment in the gig economy, these are going to be huge issues with AI coming in as well, artificial intelligence, that'll soak a lot of jobs out of the workforce. So what happens with this growing underclass and this inequality caper? I don't know what's going to happen with that. They're going to have to come up with something like a universal basic income or something of that order, because you can't have people surviving on $40 a day.
Can journalism change things?
Can who?
Can journalism change things?
I think it does, yeah. It does eventually. It's like knocking your head against a brick wall until it breaks, but the classic one, it needs community. and then it needs journalism. And the rise of independent media, I mean, if you look at Friendly Geordies, the comedian who does some serious investigative stuff, he gives it a red hot go. Now, he's got 600,000 subscribers on YouTube, right? That's triple the Fin Review and the Australian subscriber base. So, you know, the Fin Review and the Australian is still being fed just this funnel of information straight out of the PMO, straight from the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. Every day there's a, you know, the government will announce today, and then the media follows up at breakfast TV and radio, and the government will announce today, said the Australian. So, you know, they still manage to control it, and they're controlling it more tightly than ever. But the rise of social media, unless they manage to clamp down on that, has been suggested by Peter Dutton with his proposal for a defamation defence fund for politicians, and this business about whether you know, trying to get the platforms regarded as publishers. Now, there's some merit in that. It's a complicated situation, but it's all about squashing dissent. It's all about closing down dissent, and that's what they're into. And I have hope that with more engagement of people, these sort of things, social media, that there will be change. And the one example I can give you is multinational tax avoidance was never a thing. In fact, just those three letters, tax, used to just bore me to tears. But then I wrote a piece back at the Sydney Morning Herald in about 2011 or something about Google paying no tax, making all this money, and suddenly there was all this interest in there. And it developed that tax fairness, funnily enough, because tax is so boring and so complicated, tax fairness became a huge thing. And then you look around and you go, well, why did I pay more tax last year than this giant oil company, Santos or Exxon or Shell? Why did I pay literally more dollars in tax than these guys? Now, there's debt loading and there's all sorts of fancy financial shenanigans going on, and it's another story. But that coverage, due to my contacts, accountants who, you know, crusaded on this issue with me, we got the Senate inquiry going. It was Christine Milne, Sam Dastyari and Nick Xenophon were the principal political proponents of reform, and the government, and this was Hockey and Abbott, not noted for their brilliant government, but to their credit, they instituted some transparency reforms that made tax less secret, so the ATO publishes one number once a year, or three numbers for each large company, and they did some other reforms as well. And that was all because there was politicians got involved, the message was in the media, and the community went along for the ride, and they demanded of all their local MPs, we need change, and then the government reformed. It's a slow process, but those three steps do lead to reform. So things will change for the better, but it takes a long time.
Royce, can we just acknowledge for a moment the courage of investigative journalists like Michael? Michael paid a price for telling the truth and reporting the truth. And while the situation here in Australia is not as dire as it is for independent journalism overseas, where people's families are targeted, people are threatened with death and other violence for telling the truth, it is so critical that we have journalists like yourself telling inconvenient truths to power, and to do it in a way that we can access. So thank you. I just want to acknowledge you.
Thank you.
I want to pick up a thread there, because you mentioned this kind of climate of like this, the way repression works elsewhere, where it's immediate, it's obvious, it's violent, it's clear. Australia has a slightly different tack on that. I mean, what we've seen lately is the use of defamation cases to stop to keep people, to make people think twice about speaking publicly, to create a chilling effect on, you know, journalism, on commentary, on public discussion. I was hoping you both could talk a little bit about that.
Defamation?
Well, defamation, yeah.
Well, the most obvious sort of retributive act of a government is to sideline people who are people of talent, who should be being appointed to things and to overlook them or to take work away from them. And Christine Holgate is a fantastic example of that. But it's happening at a level, it's happening across many institutions in Australia. For example, you look at the stacking of the AAT with former staffers to ministerial staffers who have no particular talent beyond the fact that they worked in the office of a minister and are then appointed to the maximum term available to a statutory appointment, which is intended originally to be somebody who had bureaucratic experience in processing claims and reviewing claims on their merits. So we're seeing the alienation of people who happen to speak out and are then punished because they're overlooked, or, like Christine Holgate, they're sort of bullied out of a job. And that is there too, beyond the very obvious personal attacks. I mean, look at the outrageous attack on Gillian Triggs. Okay? Yep. That attack was designed 3 or 4 months before she copped it at a Senate committee hearing. They knew what she was going to say about government policy. They designed and crafted an attack on her personally. There were things published about her as a mother, for God's sake, in broadsheet newspapers. This taking down of the tall poppies who say what's unpopular is, in my view, despicable.
It's very rude.
And it's outrageous. When people have the courage to say unpopular things, when people have the courage to tell the truth about individuals who are being targeted, it's up to each of us to rally around and support those individuals, because I just found that intolerable. And then, of course, Gillian was offered, some overseas appointment to get out of the job because that would be convenient, it would sweep the thing under the carpet and make it go away. And what she was pointing out was the ill treatment of children in offshore detention centres, something we obviously needed to know about. So there's this double whammy sort of strategy that's in place. One is pay them off or overlook them or shun them or set them aside, and the other is the full frontal attack on people personally. And there's very few individuals in Australia who can stand up to that sort of scrutiny and that sort of attack. We've all got the parking fine that nobody wants coming out. It's just, it frightens people off running for public office. It undermines our willingness to participate in the organs and institutions of state as private citizens. It's absolutely chilling, and it drives us to a place where our democracy is fundamentally weakened because of that. Now, I assume this group here have turned up on a beautiful day like this because you care about something like that. You care about our democracy and the strength of our democracy. So I try and remember that there are many, many groups of people like you here who care about things like this, who are prepared to turn up and listen to a conversation about these things, because you do care. And you do have friends who care as well. And so that gives me hope. But I just find it intolerable the way people are targeted for speaking out and for telling the truth in this country.
I want to ask you about that, being targeted, because I imagine, Michael, you get about one defamation threat a week at this point.
Well, no, I haven't had one this year. I had 6 last year. Must be doing something wrong.
So you average about one every 2 months.
Last year was a big year. Yeah, there were a few of them last year, but I tend to, and the lawyers don't seem to have got the message yet, because I tend to just put them straight on Twitter. Private and confidential, not for publication, straight onto Twitter. So,
Does it work?
Well, it does, because I don't know who advises the lawyers sometimes, but they must be getting the message now, some of them. Because I know these guys. A lot of them used to be defence lawyers when I was working in the mainstream media, so I know them quite well, and there's some shameless ones around. There's good ones as well. But just on that what you were saying, Fiona, about there was some real progress in terms of this persecution last year in regards to women. And I was sitting there watching the mainstream media, as I do every day, and what messages are coming from where and how they're doing their propaganda for the regime. And then suddenly there was all this unruly noise from the women journalists in the press gallery who stood up and actually did a really good job over the government's treatment of women in respect of, Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, and other news stories as well. And they really stood up. And I don't think their media organisations, even the Murdoch and the Nine who trot out the government line, I don't think the editors could really stand up to people like Sam Maiden and Louise Milligan and the ABC and Laura Tingle and so on. And they really put the blokes in the shade. Well, the guys that are sitting there sort of, not doing much of a job. But that actually had a very positive social impact. It basically preserved the life of the mainstream media a bit longer, but also it very positive impact for the treatment of women and for guys generally who sort of woke up, whether they're in the political classes or elsewhere, about treatment of women in society generally. So there's some positive stuff going on, but it again, this is sort of almost beyond the call of duty because you almost had to put your job on the line in these institutions with the editors and the managers on their KPIs and their cost bases and their corporate advertisers and government. The federal government now is the biggest advertiser in Australia. Certainly we haven't even got to the election campaign, or at least the official election campaign yet, but they've vaulted even the ubiquitous Harvey Norman.
Do you think journalists learnt from watching the Trump press room shenanigans and the inability of journalists there to pin down Trump or his press spokespeople to actually give an answer to questions? Do you think our journalists watched that and said, we can't let that happen here, we've got to pin people down? Because I think we did eventually cotton on to the fact that we weren't being given straight answers by our government on a range of things. And some of those journalists, the ones you've mentioned, and some of the men, seem to have worked out, we've got a common agreement here, we don't let this person get away with it. They're going to have to walk off the stage or answer our questions. So do you think there's been a shift?
I think Trump definitely provided a template, and you can see it with the guys at the top now, Morrison, etc. I mean, Morrison is openly called a liar all the time, and he's not suing anybody because it's too demonstrably, it's provable. I mean, I hate to be overly commercial and seize the day, but we've even put out, as part of our merchandise range, a Skomokio T-shirt, which I believe is selling quite well with a very long nose on it. And I said to a lawyer mate of mine, he said, do you think he'll have a go? Because Bernard Keane over at Crikey's been doing a terrific job. He's got an almanac of all the lies. And so I said, no, mate, I think if you had a go, that you'd have the Streisand effect there, wouldn't you? And I think you'd get a lot of offers from lawyers to do some pro bono defence work around that. But yeah, he provided the template. They looked at what Trump was doing. His base didn't move at all, even though he was demonstrably telling lies every day. Had no regard for the truth whatsoever. And they looked at this and they went, yeah.
That. We want some of that.
Just, we're going to do that. A lot of them did. And a lot of it's pretty bald-faced stuff. And Aussies are more refined than Americans are because it's more, I think, probably better educated perhaps.
We have less stable geniuses.
Less stable geniuses. But yeah, there is a chilling effect from the defamation actions. And a lot of ordinary people are muzzled and shut down, and they're suing people on Twitter and so on. And
that's a good point to make, though. So I mean, from what you're describing, it seems like people have worked out that if we go after the reporters who are doing this, that might be bad for business. So instead, if we go after the random person on Twitter who says the thing I don't like, that's going to have a bigger impact. So in that sense, are we seeing a shift in tactics?
Is it about sending the message, you mean?
Yeah.
I think so. Often it's just about muzzling. So, yeah, saying like, the classic. I got one from the Catholic Church last year, and I couldn't believe the PR guy that put them up to it. First of all, we got threatened by the PR guy called Tim Allerton. You've got to name these people, frankly. There's not much point having no colour. And he threatened us, and I said, go for it, So the letter comes, and in fact, it wasn't the Catholic Church, but it's a Catholic Cemeteries Trust, which is controlled by the Catholic Church and which is funded by public money, and it's about $5 billion worth of valuable cemetery land. They're running out of cemetery land in Sydney, and it's this battle for control of this stuff. Now, they'd managed to shut down all the major media on this story, and we were the only ones that had a crack at it. And so they came at us, and I said, you guys, you can't sue. You're basically going to be deemed by a court to be a large corporation. Didn't matter. No ethics, just a bullying tactic, hoping to muzzle us. And they also threatened my young reporter, as a guy in his 20s and so on. It's all about bullying, but ultimately the defamation law is very unfair because they only benefit people at the top. I mean, if you're poor, you can't sue to protect your reputation if somebody says something nasty about you. So you've got to be wealthy for a start. So it does need to be reformed, and I would love to see the law, a bit more energy from the legal profession around this,
Yeah, I know it's on the agenda of some of the state attorney generals.
States,
so Mark Speckman and Jacqueline Symes in New South Wales and Victoria, for example, have it on the agenda. But it needs a uniform approach, definitely. It's very interesting. I've just finished a case which has been reserved against the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese of Melbourne, about institutional child sex abuse. And you're looking at the structures of the church and the way that canon law separates the obligation of the church as a juridical person or a person who can be sued and controls assets versus the community of the church and the responsibility, very, very legal question, but is one archbishop responsible for the statements or conduct of another archbishop? So if you failed me 50 years ago and I was abused as a child, is the church responsible? We thought we'd got over all of this when the Ellis defence was set aside, but the church is still running these arguments and these cases. And it is extraordinary to me that we're in a place, this is way off track, but it comes back to that question of the accountability of our institutions. The Catholic Church is a beacon for many millions of people and billions worldwide, and yet it is saying it's not responsible for the conduct of its priests towards its most innocent and vulnerable members. I find it astonishing, and I think it reflects... a litigious approach by organisations and a failure to stand up for those people who are most dependent on the succour of those institutions being offended against. I don't want to preempt what will happen in this case because, as I said, it's been reserved. But we have seen this over decades, this ability of institutions who've done wrong, despite saying good things and making good noises to the Royal Commission into institutional child sex abuse, still perpetuating the behaviour of denying responsibility, which re-traumatises people. And I think it reflects a sense of using the courts and using the laws to deny accountability. And we're in the same place we are where you're talking about using defamation laws to protect yourself against political criticism, which we should all be able to do. We should all be able to stand up in public and say, I don't like what the government's doing, or I don't like what this politician's doing. Of course we should. And if you truly are a proponent of free speech, as the government says they are, that's their bandwagon. It's free speech for anyone unless you're criticising me. So I find that extraordinary too. Sorry, that was a segue, but it came out of what you were talking about, I presume the Archdiocese of Sydney taking this approach. Or is the Cemeteries Trust some multi-archdiocese
I think
institution?
It's probably whoever's behind the Cemeteries Trust. They probably are Catholics. I don't think it's the church. It was just a tactic to try to muzzle to try to get this out of the public purview because it's a big financial deal.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. But, just on the Royal Commission, well, I know you had an involvement there, and even the good Catholics, they all agree that, it was a fantastic thing. Australia led the world in that. So I think if you have these judicial inquiries, Royal Commissions, I think they're a good thing. People say, the government says, the cost, while they're splashing our money around and pork barrelling and so on. And but frankly, you need these. The Banking Royal Commission too, I think, was worthwhile because it does throw the light on corruption and corrupt practices. And in the case of the Royal Commission into child sex abuse, just the most grotesque, horrible things that just ruin people's lives. So.
And to circle back, it's exactly why we need a national ICAC with an ability to hold public hearings.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask about that in a second, but before I do, we're going to open up the session to questions from the audience in a second. So in about 5 minutes, we'll start taking some questions. If you have one, please, by all means, go and line up there's a microphone here in the centre. Please line up and we'll get to you shortly. And before we do, I want to throw one last question to kind of round this out. Stuff's bad. How do we fix it?
Well, the National ICAC is the sort of peak focus of everybody at the moment, and it's so obvious that we need this. The concept that you would need a state ICAC at state and territory level but not at federal level where there are billions of dollars at stake is just ridiculous. And it needs to be a robust model so that it can, if an appropriate threshold is met, hold public hearings, bearing in mind the potential damage to people's reputations. So there's a way to get the balance right with those things. It needs to have broad powers. It needs to have an ability to act on its own motion or on whistleblower advice. But there's a framework of things that have been undermined, were put in place and have been undermined over the years. A code of conduct for MPs that actually has consequences for breach, right?
So I'm not sure that was a joke, but...
No, it wasn't a joke, but you're laughing because of the breaches that just happened without consequence. Ministerial standards that have consequences for breach, where people are actually removed from office by a Prime Minister who's obviously conflicted as to whether he does or doesn't move someone out of office. We need to have FOI laws strengthened so that access to information is on a push model like they have in Queensland, where information is released and only held back if there is a genuine need, rather than endlessly having journalists and other people scramble for information about why decisions are made and not made.
I think I still have an application for a review on a FOI going back 6 years from. So it's yes.
Yeah, and we need decent whistleblower laws. At the moment, whistleblower protections have ended. People like McBride and other people who've made disclosures about our tax office, about our defence force, about others. There's a question over whether they're protected disclosures or not. I mean, look at the East, the prosecution of witness Kane Bernard Collaery. How are we even in a situation where that was considered an appropriate prosecution to sign off on? I mean, really, don't we need to know that there's been espionage of our poor and vulnerable neighbour to benefit Australian corporations and politicians who then took up positions with those corporations? Of course we need to know these things. So that's a start. But fundamentally, don't we need people who stand for public office to commit to act with integrity? Really?
Well, there are some very good ones. I mean, I make a point when I come down to the beautiful South Australia to go and see Rex Patrick, because there's always a Rex has got this FOI fetish, and he seriously does. He stays up every night till the wee hours just doing FOIs. And without that, and he feeds them to various media organisations, and he gets stuff out in the open, really important things. And I mean, he's great. He's great, Rex. Of course, he doesn't get any airplay in the press down here, so nobody knows about him much. Here, he's more famous in the northern states, but you've got plenty of good ones in Labor, plenty of good ones in the Greens and the Independents. And I certainly hope, and especially our esteemed festival director, Joe Dyer. I don't know whether Joe's around, but, you know, it'd be fantastic to see the Independents get up, you know, because they will represent community interests more than the major parties. But there are good people, I mean, even in the coalition, dare I say it.
Yep.
The point is the culture. We've got systemic failures going on all over the place, and there's this culture thing. And we tried to have a discussion in the green room before we came on it. The problem is the overall societal philosophy has been neoliberalism now for many years, and it's failed, and we need to move on to a new system. But there's no prevailing, emerging ideology which is enticing people and decision makers to move to a new system. So what we have instead is crony capitalism. That's what's happened. And I don't know where it ends, but there does need to be cultural change. And the universities, of course, have lost their mojo because they've been sort of half corporatised and crushed. And there's still some great academics out there, but I'll tell you what, you know, they've lost their thought leadership, and the media is too craven and too close to big business and big politics. So that will change, I think, with the internet. I think we've only that's still at the beginning of the digital revolution, probably a little bit into it now, but it will change.
Well, we're really talking about a risk management framework here. If you recognise that any individual who puts their hand up to run for public office is immediately going to need campaign funding, you have to put measures around that or safeguards around that, because the temptation and the need to raise money is pressing from the very first moment that you put your hand up, right? You need to pay for the core flutes and the bits of paper and the town halls and all the rest of it. If you set up a framework where those campaign donations and your expenditure is disclosed in real time, right, immediately, so people can see what your interests are, not this members' register of interests where people forget to leave off their $400 million childcare centre interests for 3 years and then, oh, whoops, you know. We need that whole framework that recognises that we're all fallible as potential members and need the protections of a risk framework, so we don't get stuck in a situation where you choose between, you know, the $500,000 cheque from the foreign individual who wants to purchase your vote, or not having the funds to be able to run a decent campaign. We have to set it up so that people don't have to make those choices, because I recognise, having been through it, that it's pretty ghastly being in a campaign and having to fundraise and ask your mates for money. It's pretty awful, and well, it's just embarrassing, really. But the fact that you have to disclose things and then they don't come out for 12, 24 months later means there's no incentive to be scrutinising where those funds came from. We have to, with the whole framework, make it easy for people to comply and give them incentives to comply with integrity measures.
Look, we're coming down to the final 10 minutes, so I'm just going to go to questions. We have a few lined up, so we have the first one.
Thank you. We all know that there's GRIFT lies and influence, and we all know many of the cases that are going on that you've discussed. And many of us here rally and write letters and etc. And the institutional changes that have been suggested up there are brilliant, mandatory, necessary. And I will bet that at this federal election, mostly the same people and the same government will get in. And that breaks my heart to say that. So my question is, what can we as individuals do now, here, today, tomorrow, whatever, to make the changes without waiting for the system to change, which it won't until the people in the system change?
It's a good question.
Well, I think supporting independent politicians, journalists, you know, backing them. We all have the ability now to communicate live time. That's why we don't need funding for political parties anymore from corporations. The point was to buy newspaper ads back in the day. You don't need that. If you've got a message to sell, you go on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Reddit, TikTok. So we have the distribution mechanisms there. So it will happen, and there will be people whose voices will be heard by communities, and there will be change. Unless, of course, they make the defamation laws more draconian to muzzle everybody.
So voting is one way, obviously, and that includes how you preference people with your vote, because if you're just re-electing with your preferences the same mob, you'll get the same outcome. Don't expect anything different if you give your preference to government and your minor party who you're preferencing doesn't get up. So that's the first thing. The second thing is ring your local member now. Write to your local member now. Local members, whoever they are, whether they're government, opposition, nationals, whoever, it doesn't matter. If you raise the issue of integrity and accountability of government, they do take notice of the volume of communications coming in from their own electorate. And they will take that message, if it comes in sufficient volume, to their own party. So that's a critical thing not to be undermined. If a person is looking at their own re-election prospects, they care what their constituents think about. And if you tell them what you think about as important issues, they will bank that and take it internally to their own party. And if they're a minister, well, go for it. Tell them, attack them on government policy if that's something you care about too. Yep.
If I can extrapolate, just to draw a line through that, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the message is there is no magic button solution to this. It begins by reconnecting, by communicating, and by organising, however you can within your sphere of influence. Is that?
Yep. Absolutely.
Great.
Yep.
Next. We seem to have
Thank you both for your work. It's excellent. But Fiona, I'm hoping you'll indulge me and give me some career advice.
Sure.
As a very vocal pre-partnership lawyer in private practice, when I question a lack of diversity in the partnership structure at my firm, I'm often told it's because women get to a certain point and they leave the law, they leave private practice because they want to have children. Should I buy into that? To what extent do you think we'll ever have gender parity? And do you ever think we'll have the necessary institutional change? Do women just not have the influence to change that?
You're on another topic that's a favourite of mine that I've been talking about for 30 years, and I think you probably know that. Listen, we're on the cusp of a wave here, and we're not going away. Women are and should be at leadership roles, at least in terms of parity of numbers, in every profession in Australia. And to suggest that we are there in equal numbers at university and somehow the system doesn't support us, so we fall below 30%, in case of the law down to 10%, of senior positions, equity partners, QCs, SCs. Somehow that's women's choice and not the system supporting us, I think is also absolute bullshit. So I would say to you, work out where you want to be and go for it. Because when we stand up and say, not take no for an answer, when we say we're educated, we're dedicated, we work our guts out, we're intelligent, and we're here to contribute, firms do take notice. The bar is slower to respond, but now, at least across Australia, we have attorneys recognising that in terms of judicial appointments. So go for it and come talk to me later.
Hi. Anyone who's familiar with 12-step programs like AA will be aware of the tenet principles above personalities. And I just think we're in an age of the cult of the personality. And I understand people in the public eye need to protect themselves against defamation. But I do wonder whether even doing that buys into the whole thing of the personality, and I would just love to hear them sometimes say, this is not about me, what about blah, 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 and just keep the focus on the issue. And, it's like, I'm so tired of the personalities and it's all being about he said this. Even Scott Morrison, instead of Scott Morrison is a liar, talk about the process.
I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. I mean,
Yeah.
is there a question?
Yeah, well, that kind of is the question, is how do we keep the focus on the principles, on the issues, and not get distracted by, whether this person's a liar or whatever.
Well, it's a bit hard when you've got a mainstream media that's obsessed with distractions and is doing the government's bidding for them with minor stories when there's all sorts of egregious crimes being committed and corruption episodes elsewhere. Again, that's a control, and that will end. It has to, but at the moment, the corporate media is a factory of distractions and personality issues. And some of them play well sometimes. In the case of Christine Holgate, that was a step forward in the end, even though she had to undergo this abuse under parliamentary privilege. That ended up, I think, making some strides for the treatment of women as well. So sometimes it can be useful, but a lot of it is, as you said, it's just distractions.
Yeah, I actually think it's a really interesting question, the question of our focus on personality, because we do like to be comforted by the notion of people in charge, being nice looking, having nice families, looking like us. And we do, I think, buy into the myth that we're comforted by that rather than electing people who might look a bit scrappy or who might have an unusual family or an unusual sexual preference or might be heavens coloured, I think it is reflected in our obsession with personality over content, and we get the politicians we vote for. So I would encourage a diversity in terms of political candidates, and some of the parties are much better at that than others. The Greens have just elected or pre-selected a Senate ticket for Victoria that's entirely First Nations, which is, I think, extraordinary. And it's got to be a focus for our politicians on content over spin. So.
We probably have time for one more question.
Okay.
One more question. Sorry to those who missed out. You can grab us afterwards. You can talk to these fine people and ask them personally.
Thank you. My question deals with the National Integrity Commission.
Yes.
There is not a state integrity commission anywhere that operates in respect of political parties. A National Integrity Commission would likewise, I suspect, be designed in such a fashion that the internal governance and democracy practices, or lack of them, within established political parties would not come within the purview of that commission, notwithstanding the fact that every one of the parties, the major parties in particular, are in receipt of tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer money, both federally and at a state level, yet you could have the most undemocratic rules of those established parties, and they are funded by the taxpayer with no accountability to the general public. And if you want to see the corruption, like we saw in New South Wales with the OBEDs, or in Victoria recently, experienced there with Andrew Byrne and Adam, whatever his name is, Semajek. I would like to know whether the media would follow that through, about making sure established parties come within the purview of ICACs.
Well, it'd be great. I mean, the first thing is you can't have it in camera, as the Libs suggested. You can't have secret hearings where you have, I mean, I tend to think when we do get something, if Labor gets in and they do something, it's going to be very weak. I'm not holding out hope for something very robust. I mean, the corruption would be incredible. You'd need you need 100,000 people working for the federal ICAC just to go through all the documents. I mean, can you imagine? If you look at the procurement and all the mates deals, all the spending of our money by governments, I mean, it will be a huge job, but you've got to have open hearings, as Fiona says. It's got to have robust powers, and you can't have people like the Attorney General, as Porter suggested, being able to just nix anything because they felt like it wasn't in the national interest. I don't hold out huge hope because I think Labor's going to have a problem with it too. Even if they get in, they've got the numbers. But it's a good start. And ban political donations. They're not needed.
Can I...
And publish the company accounts of political parties. Why are these a secret? And there's heaps of them. There's one in Queensland, South Australia, etc. Publish them. See the related party transactions.
Can I just answer your question directly in terms of political parties' internal decision-making being not open to scrutiny? You're absolutely right. That's a problem that Victoria is grappling through at the moment with the new party monitor, John Thwaites, trying to work out whether revelations that have come out of IBAC are just party matters to be dealt with or not dealt with, and it's come out of federally with New South Wales, the takeover of the New South Wales branch and decisions making there about pre-selections and so on. It is an issue, and currently no model, Greens, Labor, Liberal, for an RCAC deals with it because the courts have essentially upheld the principle that party decisions are internal party business only, unless they cross into criminal behaviour. But what I would say to all political parties is that unless your own conduct internally is open to rigorous scrutiny and accountability processes, you don't deserve to govern.
And that is a very good place to leave this discussion on. I want to say thank you all for being here, for being with us, for listening to this conversation. Can I get a big round of applause for our guests today? And if you were here, if you've enjoyed this, please, for those of us who work with words, this is our life, our heart, our living and our art. Please go to the book tent, buy some books, pin them down afterwards, get your book signed by Fiona. Support us so we can continue doing this work. Thank you. And subscribe to Michael West.
Thank you.
As we sail towards the election, we'll keep you up to speed on all the developments in federal politics. We'll try to get you the real story, not the exclusive